You might be wondering what I am doing kneeling on the floor in my living room. This may be my living room, but at the moment there doesn't appear to be anywhere to sit because the place is full of recorders. What is a viol player's house doing full of recorders? The main reason is that I have found myself in lockdown with a whole bunch of instruments that don't usually live here. They are on their way to other places or on their way back from various concerts, and they were here sort of supposedly moving on, but then the moving on never happened because we got stuck. So I thought I would make the most of it, and I thought it would be nice to spend 2, possibly 3 videos over a period of time looking at playing these instruments in combination together. I think it's very common to find people who play both types of instrument, but I think it's also common to find that as a viol player you frequently find yourself in places full of recorder players and you know that the instruments combine really well together, but actually you don't really know which recorder is which and what they do, how they function and which parts they ought to be playing. And I think recorder players find the same with viols, that again they frequently find themselves with viol players, perhaps on a course. They know that a broken consort would be a really nice idea, but they're not quite sure which viols they might need and how they might use them when they get there. So broken consort is, I think, one of the most beautiful sounds. I think the instruments complement each other really well, and it is possible for it to be a really very satisfying sound and a really beautiful thing to play. It's also possible for it to be less successful, and generally when things don't work quite so well, it's because people have made not great choices about either the repertoire that they've chosen or perhaps most commonly about the way they've distributed the instruments across the parts. So I'm just going to give you some general tips, things that you might consider, and things that there's always more than one way of doing things, but there are some general principles that if you applied, let's say you're on a course and you've got one session, 1 hour and a half slot, and you want the best chance of that consort working really well, there are some basic principles that you could apply to give yourselves the best chance of a successful session. So I thought we'd look at that. One of the first things I think you need to know if you are a viol player is that the bass recorder, in terms of broken consort, does not function as a bass instrument, despite the name. And I think this is one of the most common confusions, is that instruments that are named certain ways carry certain expectations, and then actually that's not quite how they work. So bass recorder, if you have a recorder consort with a descant at the top, a treble or alto on the second line down, a tenor and a bass at the bottom, that forms a perfectly plausible recorder consort. But it plays at what we call 4-foot pitch, which means that the sound of the consort is an octave higher than the written pitch of the music. So if you play descant, treble, tenor, bass, recorder, and then treble, tenor, tenor, viol, the recorder consort will sound an octave higher. If you play at written pitch, like a viol consort, recorder players or anybody would call that 8-foot pitch. So 4-foot is your high recorder consort pitch, and 8-foot is what you get with a bigger consort of bigger recorders, and that is the pitch that viols play at. So what you can't do, for example, is have a consort where you have treble, tenor, tenor, viol, and then put a bass recorder on the bottom, because you would have the top 3 parts at 8-foot pitch and your bass at 4-foot, so your bass an octave higher than your top 3 parts. It won't work, doesn't work harmonically, despite the fact that the name of this instrument is bass recorder. So it's a really common confusion. So if we can't put a bass recorder on the bass, what kind of recorder can we put on an 8-foot bass line? So meet Greg. This is Greg. Greg is a contrabass recorder, a contrabass in F. They don't all look like this. You get different models, different types. This one is affectionately known as the wardrobe because it just looks a bit like the IKEA flat pack version, doesn't it? They're fantastic instruments, these. A contrabass in F is what you would play if you wanted a recorder on a bass line at 8-foot pitch. So this will play at the printed pitch, at the same pitch that a bass viol would play at. So the contra will be your bass line. The tenor line in an 8-foot recorder consort would be a great bass in C. So this is where I think the naming is potentially confusing. Something that is called great bass or C bass, and you think, oh, it must be a really low sound, it's a really big recorder. It is a big recorder, it is a low sound, but at 8-foot pitch, this is your tenor part. That will play at the written pitch of a tenor line. Great bass or C bass. So in recorder terms now, this bass recorder has become your alto line. Terminology confusing, isn't it? Terminology confusing enough if you're a recorder player, but if you're a viol player, you can be forgiven for thinking that a bass recorder ought to play a bass part. But if we're talking 8-foot pitch, a bass recorder is your alto voice. And then right at the top, sometimes you can put a bass recorder on the top part. It depends on the range of the parts. Depends slightly on what key you're in, depends how many parts there are. But you can sometimes have a bass at the top of a consort. If you don't, you're going to want a tenor recorder on the top. So that's top tip number 1. A bass recorder is not a bass instrument when it comes to broken consort. Tip number 2, and this applies to both families of instruments. Essentially, you want to use the biggest instruments you can lay your hands on. So the biggest recorders, and basically tenor and bass viols. It is possible to use smaller of both, but in general, you should be wary of playing anything smaller than a tenor recorder, and you should think very carefully about using a treble viol, just in terms of pitch and how to distribute the instruments. You tend to find that the bigger instruments give you more options and are going to be a more successful sound. Top tip number 3, always put a viol at the bottom of your consort. Why would we do that? We've got a contra and we've said that that plays at 8-foot pitch as well, and the bass viol and the contra play in the same register. It's true, but in terms of sound, in the recorder sound, there are a lot more high harmonics in the sound. And in the string sound, there's a lot more what you might call fundamental to the note. You tend to find that if there are 2 bass parts, that if you put the contra on the bottom and the bass viol on the first bass part, sometimes you don't actually hear the contra as the bottom of the consort. There's just something about the string sound that makes it a better basis right at the bottom of the ensemble. It also helps hugely with tuning. So on a recorder, on a bass recorder or on a contra, if you finger a 3-finger note, that's going to sound a C. Broadly speaking, if you blow harder, put more air through your instrument, that C is going to rise in pitch. You haven't moved any fingers, but the pitch has gone up. If you put less air through the recorder, or don't blow quite so hard, the pitch of that C will sink. So it's a movable feast without moving any fingers at all. If you play the C string on your bass viol, it's going to be a C. If you've tuned it sharp, it will be sharp. If you've tuned it flat, it will be flat. but the note that you've got is the note that you are stuck with. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't blow harder, blow faster, raise your eyebrows, curl your toes. Any of those bona fide recorder tuning techniques are not going to make any difference to the pitch of your viol string. So why does that help? Well, if you can vary the pitch that you play a recorder at, if you're playing in a group that's completely recorder based, people can move their pitch to tune to each other. If you play against a fixed pitch, that pitch doesn't move, and then these instruments have got something to pitch against when they're tuning. So a good example of this is if you look at the opening of the piece that you heard at the beginning of this video, and there's a link to it below, you'll see that it starts with the top 3 voices. And I thought, okay, when I record this, the part I'll put down first is the tenor part, because it's the lowest, the bass part effectively of the 3 parts that we start with. So I recorded that part first, and I really carefully checked the tuning. It's a recorder on that part in this version. I checked it really carefully before I started, and I recorded that part. And then I thought, okay, I'm in recorder mode, I'll put the next recorder part in. So I recorded that, and it was very nicely in tune with the recorder part that I'd put down first. This is going well, this is good, 2 nicely in tune recorder parts. Now I'll add the tenor viol. Tune my viol really carefully to the same tuning meter that I checked the recorders with, recorded that line, and it was a complete disaster. The tuning was terrible. So I went back to the meter and checked the viol, and it was fine. What I discovered was that although I started with the recorders at a pitch I checked at, my own keeping of pitch with nothing to pitch against actually meant I didn't end up quite in tune according to the meter. I was completely able to tune the recorders to themselves, but as soon as you put a string part in, that part just doesn't have the facility to adjust. As viol players, we are very much less flexible about tuning than wind players are. So, as most of our music from the sort of period that we tend to play from is built tuning-wise from the bass upwards, it makes sense to have the inflexible, hopefully reliably in tune, but immovable pitch instrument at the very base of your consort. And it means that everybody above that can tune in relation to the bass part. So always put a bass viol in the bottom of a broken consort. So what about then the rest of the parts? 4-part piece. So I think it would be nice if it was 2 viols and 2 recorders rather than 3 of one and 1 of the other. We've decided that we always have a bass viol on the bottom, so that's that part sorted. I think it's nice not to have the viols at the bottom of the consorts and the recorders at the top, and that kind of split in the middle. I think it misses the point of the blended sound between the 2 families of instruments. So I think it's better if you mix them up. So on the tenor part then, let's put a recorder rather than a viol. 8-foot pitch. Which recorder is our tenor voice? It's the great bass, isn't it? The C bass. So that's what we're going to put on the tenor line. The top 2 parts are slightly more open to debate. So we've got a tenor viol that we can employ and another type of recorder. The version that you heard at the beginning of this video had the tenor viol on the top line, and it had a bass recorder doing its job as the alto part on the second line. And that works perfectly well. There would be another way to do it though, and an equally valid way. What if we move the tenor viol down to the alto part and we put a recorder on the top? So that would need to be the tenor recorder on the top line. That is an equally plausible way of distributing the parts in this piece. And it sounds like this.